Welcome, everyone. My name is Jeff Eisenach. I'm a visiting scholar here at the American Enterprise Institute and working on technology issues, telecom issues, and a lot of the issues that we're here to talk about today. It is an honor for us to have here with us today Commissioner Michael O'Rielly from the Federal Communications Commission. I'm going to keep my introduction very brief. Mike will then speak for a little bit with some opening remarks. We'll have a conversation to follow that, and assuming there's time available, we'll have some questions from the audience. So that's our basic setup. The title of our event today is Big Change at the Federal Communications Commission. Full disclosure, I had the pleasure of and honor of working on the Trump administration's transition team for the FCC, and I'd known Mike before then, but got to know him better during those times. And we, transition teams, it's easy. You get to have lots of ideas and don't have to execute anything. So we had a lot of fun coming up with big ideas about ways to improve the Federal Communications Commission, and that was certainly not a hard thing to do at that point, in my personal opinion. But I've come up with the ideas in any case. But then it fell on the actual commissioners to execute. I think we've had Ajit Pai over here since he's been chairman, and I think he's done an absolutely fabulous job, and he's done a fabulous job working with our guest today, Mike O'Rielly, who has taken the lead on some important issues, and I know been an intellectual force within the commission, as well as a force just for comedy within the commission. At the end of the last administration, I think there are a lot of people who felt the commission had become a not all that friendly place to work, and I think that's another area where the current team has really tried to improve things. So I'm very proud to have been associated with this group of folks who has gone on to execute not just the wild fantasies we came up with during the transition, but really gone beyond that. And accomplished more than I think anybody could have thought was possible. Mike has been at the FCC since 2013. He was appointed by President Obama. We don't hold that against him. He previously worked for Senator John Cornyn, Senator John Kyle, who is a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute these days, and had been a policy analyst on the Banking Technology Committee in the Senate as well. So he's been in town for quite a while, came to the FCC with a great background and knowledge of telecom issues, and has had the opportunity to put that to work, as I've said, with great effect. So, Commissioner O'Rielly, it's an honor to introduce you and have you here today.
Well, thank you so very much, Jeff, for your kind words and introduction. I must admit before I begin that I am suffering from the first day of allergies, and so if I grab for my Kleenex, I apologize. I don't mean to be rude, but it is of that season, and I just it hits me for about a week, and then I have to suffer through that, and we'll move on. But it's an absolute pleasure to be back with you. I thank the American Enterprise Institute for the invitation to share some thoughts on the policy issues before the Federal Communications Commission. As some of you may know, I have a reputation for trying to be fairly substantive in my remarks and comments. Critics have said this is extensively boring, but I live on. I find comfort deep in the weeds of an obscure regulation or ensconced in the details of a policy debate. That may not be all that interesting to some, but if ever there was an audience that may appreciate such an approach, it would be this one. AEI, rightfully recognized throughout Washington, D.C., is the preeminent think tank for its in-depth policy analysis, economic rigor, and scholarly research. Nonetheless, if you find yourself dozing off, do give me a wink or a nod to change subjects. As American humorist and legendary Toastmaster Harry Hirschfield was quoted as saying, "My job is to talk, your job is to listen. If you finish first, please let me know." My goal today is to delve into 4 apparently unrelated policy issues being discussed these days and hopefully tie them together to paint a larger picture of this Commission's commitment to sound policy, economic freedom, and fiscal constraint. I want to start with one of the highest priorities for the Commission and me personally. Over the last 3+ years, the Commission has rightfully focused its time and energy to ensure the next generation, or 5G, networks come to fruition. Why is this so important? It's not because the shiny new technology that can bring stated benefits of high wireless speeds, lower latency, increased capacity, and many other features, although that is likely all true. Instead, it's about a global race to be the first among many countries to 5G. As a regulator, a term I actually abhor, this is generally not our primary mission. But here, the ramifications are so significant and our function so germane that it has become a primary function and focus of mine. Leading the world in 5G will allow U.S. companies to help shape the future growth, standards, and capabilities, all of which have a tremendous impact on our future economic success. The alternative means that will be dictated to by other regimes, many of which can't be fully trusted, don't believe in capitalism, don't believe in freedom, don't believe in fair play, don't believe in the role of the individual over the government, and rebuke American leadership. The bottom line is simple. We seek not to set industrial policy, but to prevent others from doing so against our interests. That means the Commission must create the appropriate regulatory environment for U.S. private sector to undertake the huge capital expenditures critical for success. Key to this is making sure our wireless providers have large swaths of spectrum, both licensed and unlicensed, along with cell infrastructure builds unlike anything we've seen before. So let's delve into spectrum policy. 2 days ago, the Commission approved a public notice seeking comment on the auction procedures for the 24 and 28 gigahertz bands. This will help set the stage to make available new millimeter wave spectrum. The next step will be to finalize the rules and set an auction timetable for the remaining bands, particularly 37 and 39 gigahertz. Accordingly, wireless providers need to know when these and other auctions will be held so that they can formulate business plans, create auction strategies, and obtain the financial resources necessary to participate. It still surprises me that some think that money grows on trees, or that auction participation is somehow guaranteed. Did we not learn anything after the 600 megahertz incentive auction? Indeed, companies have balance sheets, debt-to-equity ratios, and responsibilities to shareholders, and they need the requisite time to plan. On that note, the Commission must also be better prepared by updating its auction software. After spending approximately $100 million per year on our auction program, we ought to have greater flexibility and functionality when it comes to our auction procedures. This is especially true since our auctions for the foreseeable future are likely to involve more licenses, occur more frequently or even simultaneously, and be more complex. We cannot afford additional delays. The time to start modernizing our capabilities was yesterday. Further, the Commission must expedite its mid-band efforts, as the international focus on 5G has centered on these frequencies, and there is and are economic efficiencies from global harmonization. To that end, in the next few months, we will complete our review of the 3.5 gigahertz or CBRS band priority access licenses structure and adopt new rules. We will also continue to take the necessary steps to make technical supporting systems operational so that unused spectrum in the band is available while incumbent users are protected. Expanding on this success will require accelerating work on bands adjacent to 3.5 gigahertz, starting in the 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz band. I've taken the lead in pushing for a reallocation of this band, and now various ideas on how to clear it are on the record, including a market-based approach filed by certain wireless and satellite entities. This method provides an attractive option that should be thoroughly considered, particularly because of the speed in which it could bring the spectrum to market. But there are still some unknowns. To make this worthwhile, an adequate amount of spectrum, at least 200 to 300 megahertz to start, needs to be made available in this band. We also need more information about how licensing would work. The Commission needs to issue an NPRM this summer to explore all of the relevant issues. In the same notice, the Commission should take the next steps to reallocate the 6 gigahertz band for unlicensed services. This is particularly timely with the release of a recent technical study demonstrating that such use won't cause harmful interference to incumbents. To the extent necessary, interference mitigation can resolve any arising problems. On a related issue, just last month, Commissioner Carr took the lead to relieve the burdens presented by historic preservation and environmental reviews on infrastructure deployments, specifically small cells. It's a project I've been actively involved for quite a while and know how messy obtaining approvals can be. In the end, our action will allow for timely and cost-effective network builds with huge savings available to expand these networks beyond the urban core. Later this summer, you should expect to see a complementary item to reduce the barrier state and localities place on such deployments. Closing out this topic, my goal is to secure the ability of U.S. industry to win the 5G race. The tools to make that happen, releasing additional spectrum, and dealing with government-laid barriers are in the Commission's crosshairs. Next, I'd like to spend a few moments on the Federal Universal Service Fund, specifically setting an overall budget and allocating funding within that budget. These are necessary steps not only to provide certainty for program participants, but also to be able to manage the total impact on consumers and businesses who pay extra fees on their phone bills to support USF. Over the past several years, the Commission has conducted ongoing proceedings on each of the 4 programs, High Cost, Lifeline, E-Rate, and Rural Health Care, to update our rules and ensure that they support broadband service. Not surprisingly, commenters in each of the proceedings have used these opportunities to advocate for more funding. At present, the Commission has authorized spending of approximately $11 billion for universal service. That's $4.5 for high cost, $3.94 billion plus annual inflation for E-Rate, $2.25 billion or more for Lifeline, and $400 million for rural health care. But those numbers are not final. The Commission is currently considering additional increases for high cost and rural health care, and E-Rate commenters have requested additional dollars to further expand that program, which, by the way, was doubled by the last Commission. Additionally, as program budgets are increasingly tied to inflation, some additional growth will happen automatically. Without an overall budget across all 4 programs, there has been little impetus to control individual program spending. Or to attempt some economic terminology, why choose between guns or butter when you can have more of both? Of course, that's ultimately unsustainable. There must be some limit on the total amount we're willing to take out of the pockets of the American people. In fact, the D.C. Circuit recently reiterated in a case involving AT&T that the statutory goal of providing sufficient funding is not simply a means to sweeten the pot for providers, but rather is intended to strike the appropriate balance between the interest of consumers and industry. In fact, the court stated, too ample funding may even itself violate the sufficiency requirements of the Act by so detracting from universal service by causing rates unnecessarily to rise, thereby pricing some consumers out of the market. If the total budget cannot be increased beyond $11 billion, and I don't think it should be, then there's time and necessary to decide how to apportion the funding within the overall budget. Fortunately, the Commission has some flexibility within this top-line figure. According to the USF Administrator's annual report for 2017, actual program disbursements totaled $8.85 billion. Of course, there is always some amount adjusted for after the fact, but that is an approximate figure for actual spending and is generally consistent with prior year's numbers. That means there's about $2 billion difference between the authorized spending and actual disbursements that could be shifted amongst the 4 programs. How to allocate funding within the overall budget is a conversation I've wanted to have for a long time. There seems to be an informal détente amongst different program stakeholders such that increases in one program are not to be opposed or even commented on by stakeholders from another. That may have worked while the Commission was willing to spend more on each program, but with authorized spending topping $11 billion, it's time to institute the practice by which further increases in one program must be paired with offsets in another. That's not intended to favor or penalize a specific program. Rather, it should prompt a holistic and fulsome discussion in the record of whether particular funding increases are warranted. Viewed in isolation, discrete funding requests may seem appropriate. But once all program stakeholders have an incentive to highlight the cost and benefits and identify any trade-offs, the Commission may choose to prioritize other funding needs. In short, engaging in this type of discussion and analysis will provide better, reasoned, and more consistent funding decisions across the 4 programs. Another issue I've been working on is a broad review of the Commission's rules regarding the airing of children's programming, commonly referred to as KidVid. Essentially, by law, broadcasters are required to provide educational and informational programming to children in order to get their broadcast licenses renewed. In 1996, the FCC fleshed out a series of regulations on what exactly this requirement entailed. Specifically, broadcasters must air 3 hours weekly of informational and educational programming for children that is at least 30 minutes in length, regularly scheduled, and aired between the hours of 7 a.m. and 10 p.m. Unfortunately, the Commission rules, while well-intended, have not worked in delivering high-quality content for children. There are a number of reasons for this. At its core, the Commission found a market failure in the delivery of children's programming and responded by trying to create a market through regulations. And, as is often the case when government tries to create a market, this endeavor failed spectacularly. In fact, in data presented to me on the combined viewership of all 4 major television networks, there's been a 99% decline in children viewership ages 2 to 11 on Saturday mornings. 99%. That's an important segment of children that are simply not watching Commission's mandated KidVid programming. What are they watching? Ironically, some are turning to online sites like YouTube, a completely unregulated platform that may deliver high-quality programming to children, or may label content as children's programming, but instead offer something quite different. I've seen this firsthand as a father of a 2-year-old. Even worse, well, the market of government the government sought to create never took off. Other markets were killed off in the process. For example, prior to our KidVid requirements, broadcasters aired programming under 30 minutes in length, like Schoolhouse Rock, and uniquely programming that was not regularly scheduled, like after-school specials, that were oftentimes popular with children. Once the FCC determined that this would not count towards a broadcaster's core programming requirement, interest in producing such shows ceased. Despite these shortcomings, I also understand that while the market has significantly changed and children like mine are fortunate enough to have a host of programming options at their fingertip, and I really do mean their fingertips, not all children are so lucky. While figures vary, we believe somewhere between 7 and 10% of the American population are over-the-air only families. These children's access to informational and educational programming is solely through their local broadcaster. So where do we go from here? This summer, I expect the Commission to tee up a rulemaking based on my recommendations that will explore ways to breathe flexibility into our rules. In this rulemaking, we should eliminate the elements of our rules that have had unintended consequences and streamline the reporting requirements our rules currently impose. Further, we need to find a way to focus our efforts on over-the-air only households that truly do not have other options. Procedurally, I'm hopeful that more people will weigh in on the costs and benefits of the children's KidVid requirements so we can build a robust record on this critical issue. Finally, turning to one of my favorite topics at the Commission, I'd like to spend a few minutes discussing FCC process reform. Since joining the Commission, improving the general workings of the agency has been a very top priority of mine. For example, having worked on a number of public bills during my time on Capitol Hill, it troubled me that the Commission voted on rules impacting major sectors of the economy without making the rulemakings or report and orders publicly available until after the vote. When I suggested changes to this practice, then Chairman Wheeler and others suggested that such an idea was a non-starter and would bring about a regulatory Armageddon to the Commission. Fortunately, shortly after Chairman Pai took the reins of the Commission, he began a pilot program to make Commission meeting items publicly available in advance of our vote. After an early success, he made the practice permanent. And the doomsday scenarios never materialized. In fact, transparency has resulted in more informational discussions, fewer unnecessary meetings, and overall a better work product. Who would have guessed it? I believe this process reform has been a resounding success, so much that we need to apply more transparency to other items, including those on the Commission's circulation list. Otherwise, the Commission risks creating a secretive, potential abusive path for considering documents of any length and importance. And while I'm giving the chairman kudos, I would be remiss not to mention the establishment of the Office of Economics and Analytics, which will bring a more fulsome cost-benefit analysis discussion to our items. I know that this item is particularly near and dear to so many people here today. Importantly, if the Commission doesn't know or understand the real economic costs and benefits of our decisions, we cannot fulfill our congressional mandate to make reasoned and justified decisions. It is my understanding that setting up this office is underway and that the Commission is currently examining and identifying key people for its leadership positions. But once these positions are filled and the office is up and running, we should be able to quickly integrate the work into the Commission. To achieve this, in our item establishing the Office of Economic Analysis and Analytics, I worked with the chairman to ensure that the office will undertake a rigorous, economically grounded cost-benefit analysis for any rulemaking deemed to have an annual effect on the economy of $100 million or more. We also adopted a requirement that OEA, similar to the Office of General Counsel, will need sign-off from on any item prior to its release to the public. Equally important, we must also ensure that the analysis is credible and accurate. Therefore, I secured the chairman's commitment that the Commission will move a separate rulemaking in the very near future for purposes of requiring OEA to follow the guidelines of OMB Circular A4, which standardizes the way costs and benefits are measured and reported across executive agencies. Ultimately, making meeting items publicly available 3 weeks in advance of a vote and establishing the OEA are key reforms that will certainly improve the inner working of the agency. I have a few additional ideas, 40 or 50 to be exact, that I hope to share with the chairman shortly. Some of these are new and some of them are like making the circulation items public. You've heard from me before. Overall, my ultimate goal remains to leave the Commission in a better procedural place than I found it. So, in conclusion, I am hopeful that the 4 issues I've discussed and outlined today give you some comfort that the Commission is following the right course of action. Key core principles, such as complying with the law, reviewing the submitted record, and abiding by sound economics rather than political considerations, will continue to guide this Commission's outcomes. So I want to thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you or Jeff may have. So thanks very much.
Watch your step. Well done.
So,
before we begin with the Q&A, you're on television. This is being live streamed. So if you're going to ask a question, just realize that it will be seen by millions, or at least dozens. Secondly, please wait for the microphone before asking your question, since we are being live streamed. And please say who you are, so that we know who's asking. Speak clearly into the microphone. Please ask a question and don't make a speech, and make it a short question if you can. It's
a lot of requirements.
It's a lot of requirements, but I'll remind you of them if they're not followed. Feel free to remind you. Commissioner, that's in 20 minutes or so, just an amazing set of things that you laid out there.
Everyone's still awake. I looked out there.
That's right. And I've got a couple of kind of high-level things I want to ask about, but let me drill into one item that you mentioned and just get you to expand a little bit on the Lifeline reforms that I think have been adopted. The Lifeline program has been, there have been, I think, 4 or 5 different GAO studies over the course of the last decade or so, and each one reads more or less like the next, except the numbers get larger, and really go to the fact that a very substantial proportion of Lifeline funds have gone to have not had the effect of increasing penetration of either wireline or more recently mobile services. So the fact that the program has not met its objectives. And then there have been issues of fraud, which have been very substantial in terms of money just not going to that purpose at all, to the intended purpose at all. Now, I think I understand that you all adopted some reforms which, among other things, required that lifeline subsidies be provided via infrastructure-based carriers.
We're in the process of looking at that option. We haven't quite got that far, but definitely in the mix.
So I just wanted to give you a chance to talk a little bit more about your thoughts on how to go about reforming Lifeline, and whether the reseller option is eliminating resellers is one of the things you think ought to be on the table.
Well, so for a little bit of background, a Lifeline program now spends about $1.3 billion a year. It has been plagued with a number of problems, as Jeff indicated. A number of those are structural. They get to the heart of the matter, and I would have liked to have looked at those, plus the waste and fraud and abuse the charges that have been rightfully labeled against the program. But before we decided to expand the program to broadband services, I didn't win that debate, and the previous commission said we're going frontal towards this issue, and we're going to ignore those other things. We think we've taken care of them with some other changes we've made. I didn't quite agree with that analysis, but I lost that discussion, and so we plowed ahead and expanded the program. That's why its budget's now $2.25 billion, but it's actually not a budget because it basically is a cap to a point where if we got to that number, we would then make a decision what to do at that point, or just let it keep spending. So it is in fact it's the only program of the four that doesn't have an individual budget. But you highlighted a couple of changes that Chairman Pai has put forward in a very thoughtful way to try and figure out if there's a different way to get to get subsidies out. Is there a different way and a different target for how those subsidies should be distributed? The chairman has been, in my opinion, wrongly attacked for trying to thoughtfully look at different ideas along this front. And it's a proposal that he put out there where he took a number of comments. He certainly, taken a number of people who had criticisms of that. But we have to decide, as I highlighted in my comments, based on our law, on the law that's written and our record on what to do. And we're kind of digesting that as we speak, and hopefully we'll have a resolution in the coming weeks or months.
Well, thank you. Just to expand, the way that program is structured, the subsidies which are intended to go to individuals to help them afford broadband or mobile communication services are provided through companies. And so basically the way it works is if I can say to the Federal Communications Commission, I signed somebody up who's eligible, the Federal Communications Commission USAC starts sending me a check for $10 or $12 a month.
$9.25.
And in perpetuity until somebody can demonstrate that this eligible person has died. Or
we've made a number of improvements. There are definitely things that we have a national verifier. We're trying to get up and operational to make sure you're not collecting multiple checks in the same household. There are a number of things that we've done, and some of those will hopefully come online. I question whether they're going to actually get to their form that people would like them to do. They are not the panacea that some hold out to be, but there are hopefully improvements on that. But it doesn't get to the fundamental question of have you actually increased penetration? Would this have done better without the subsidies in the first place? Could we have gotten to where we are without the program? That's a fundamental question. Does the program actually serve a purpose fundamentally for changing the outcome, or are we just subsidizing people's everyday lives? Economic data on here would suggest the latter, but we'll just have to see.
Let me move to. So thank you for that. Let me move to a different topic and one I know we'll be a little bit sensitive to. So let me make sure I'm asking the question at a very broad level. I know you answered at a very broad level in terms of public policy as opposed to anything specific, and the topic being mergers. During several of the reviews that were conducted under the prior administration, both you and now Chairman Pai were pretty critical of the process by which the FCC has reviewed transactions under utilizing both the public interest standard but also the ancillary authority under the Clayton Act, and applying also an antitrust standard, and the question whether that's duplicative and whether that's a good use of the Commission's resources, a good way to go about assessing the effects of mergers. So again, without any reference to any specific transaction, do you still have those concerns about the standards and the process that the Commission ought to apply in looking at mergers that are unlike the AT&T transaction within its purview under the Communications Act?
Well, so in the answer to that is both yes and no, in the sense that I still have the larger concerns that our review process in the past has been problematic, and it has not stayed within the four corners of the application. But we came, basically a barter system. You tell me what you would like. You want a merger approved? Well, tell me what you're offering. You're going to give me $100 million for this? You're going to buy me some ambulances? What are you going to give me to make enough money in this hand to balance out this hand? At some point, I said, why don't we just give them the cold hard cash, right? Like, let's just make it a trade. Why bother coming up with this false public interest idea that you bought something meritorious? Just give them the cash if that's what. But anyway, that's the first part of the answer is I don't have concerns because Chairman Pai is a very thoughtful leader and he's a good friend, and we've had very few merger applications before us, and again, I never talk about them specifically, but in general. He's done a thoughtful job on these, and so I have less concern about his stewardship of the process than anyone else's, and therefore, I still think it's proper for us to reform that entire structure. I don't want to rest on our laurels with the idea that the Chairman Pai is going to stay forever, because no one does in government, and there will be a new commission someday. And a commission that I'll probably disagree with, and I'd like to make sure that we can, put it into a structure that actually works not only for now but forever, or at least in a much longer time period. So I do think it's something, whether it's something we could do internal or something we have to work with the Congress to structure differently. I do think that's incredibly important and should be done, even though I think that Chairman Pai does a wonderful job.
Well, I'll leave it at that. We could go on that, but so let me move to the hot topic, and then we'll take some questions from the audience in a minute. But so you can't pick up a newspaper or turn on television or the internet without seeing something about China. And yesterday, the FCC waded in a little bit with a NPRM, and it was reported, I think, at least in the Wall Street Journal and a couple other places, as kind of a done deal, and not as I understand it, but an NPRM that would look at the use of universal service funds for equipment manufactured by certain Chinese, I think primarily Chinese manufacturers, but more broadly anything that could threaten national security. In your statement, you expressed both support for that, but also some concerns about the potential impact on consumers and rural carriers, higher costs, and so forth. So I just wanted to give you an opportunity to expand on that, and then I've got a follow-up.
Sure. Well, I think the chairman is absolutely right to bring forward the item. I think it was, a thoughtful approach for an NPRM process to solicit comments. It's not about one company or one country. It's about making sure that our national security interests are protected, and therefore I thought the questions that were asked, and Commissioner Carr added, broadened the conversation a little bit. I thought that was completely appropriate, and I'm interested in seeing what the comments take us and what direction they take us and what the solutions may be. I want to make sure the global concerns that I do agree with, how do they formulate into policies? There are a number of things with universal service, how broadly we should go in terms of potentially cutting off dollars or not. And there have been a bunch of details that are going to require a lot of commentary from the outside public, and we'll just have to digest them all at the right time and then figure out where best to go. But I think the chairman's right for facilitating the conversation. I was supportive of that, and now it's really the details of the nit and gritty of government work that we'll see where we end.
So two follow-ups. First, there have been some. We had Chairman Wheeler at the American Enterprise Institute. People may not remember that. Several years ago, speaking on the topic primarily of cybersecurity, and it was a little controversial then, and maybe still is, that the FCC would have a role in the cybersecurity arena. There was some discussion of whether or not the cybersecurity office at the FCC was really necessary or a good idea. Now that we're where we are, how do you think about the FCC's role more broadly in that set of issues?
Well, I believe that cybersecurity is an incredibly important issue, and it's something that I spent a good deal of time on Capitol Hill looking at and examining what could be potential solutions in terms of strengthening and preventing bad actors in that space. We are, as I commented in my speech, we are limited to what's actually in the law itself. And my good friend Chairman Wheeler didn't exactly believe in the statute, didn't find that to be limiting in his practices, and so that didn't prevent him from doing things. For me, it does. And so I don't find the statute that extensive to allow us to delve into the issue of cybersecurity or in the area of privacy in general. And though the two are different, I don't want to conflate the two, but they have some overlap depending on the specifics of the case. So I don't think we have that authority. If I've stated multiple times, though, and testified to the fact, if Congress gives us that authority, I will do whatever they ask us to do. Right now, they have already given that authority to other agencies. In the case of privacy, you have an FTC that has authority and an extensive track record on the subject matter. In the case of cybersecurity, you have Department of Homeland Security that has broad authority in this space and been given specific tasks by the Congress just for this very purpose. So one of the important things of a government regulator, and again, I don't like that term, but one of the important things is to respect your limitations. And here, we weren't asked to do certain things. If that changes, I will certainly change with the times.
Right. So last question on this topic,
Sure.
and then we will get to questions. And that is, you mentioned also in your statement the need to reform Team Telecom. And the words, I think, are opaque and unnecessarily lengthy process that exists under the current structure. So talk more about that. What do you have in mind?
Sure.
when you
So for those unfamiliar, there's 6 or 7 federal agencies that make up what's known as Team Telecom. And they provide us advice on national security matters. We are an independent agency and take and solicit their comments as needed, and then digest them and make the best decision that we can with them. They do not have an overriding factor on us, but they are important in our consideration. Those 6 or 7 agencies I spoke of, Team Telecom really doesn't exist. It's not a statutorily set structure, and their process for deciding things has been problematic because there is no process within how they're to operate, and they have other responsibilities that they don't often, do these things in a timely manner. So when we have a number of applications that have sit for quite a while, extensive time periods. When you have people that are trying to make decisions, you have companies that have put capital at risk, waiting for a decision from the FCC that's tied up into a process that they can't get their hands around. That's problematic in my opinion. I think everyone is due a decision up or down at the appropriate time. So what I have called for, and I think is incredibly appropriate, is to basically copy the model we have for CFIUS. CFIUS covers a lot of transactions, most of the transactions outside of the telecom space. So we can copy that model over to Team Telecom. So that gives it structure and timing. And I think those are important elements to fixing that process so that we actually will get some decisions. You can see in CFIUS there are decisions that are made all the time. Some of them don't raise to the high profile structure, but they're made in a timely manner and they're made in national security interest in mind. And that's exactly what we need out of Team Telecom, and I think is so needed for reform. The good news is that Chairman Pai agrees with me, and we've had many conversations on this in the past and just reiterated that point just recently. And so I hope, and I believe actually, we're going to get an item in the very near future to resolve the Team Telecom structure from our perspective. We have the right to set up the structure in terms of what we expect from comments that are submitted to us from anybody, including the executive branch. And so we can set up that process for our own benefit. They can then, and there are multiple ideas that have been out there for setting up, providing some more specificity on their structure that I can't probably set up in my bailiwick, but I can certainly decide how comments are going to be processed within our agency. And so I think that's just incredibly important going forward, given how telecom has always been global, but it's even more global. It's even more intertwined with the rest of the economy and the world process.
Well, I promised questions. We've got just a couple of minutes left, and we may go a couple minutes over if we have more than a few people who want to ask questions. So, but we're not going to go far over. So I'll let you choose.
Feel free.
All right, let's go here in front.
Thank you. Hi, Philip Ellison. Commissioner O'Rielly, we're long past...
I think you broke his rule. You got to recommend who you're from.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Grapevine Development. I'm a real estate developer in California, which I happen to be here. But anyhow, we're long past the era of the fairness doctrine, and over the past 25, 30 years, the Commission has done an incredible job in opening markets, digitalization, new technologies, expanding the options for people to communicate, which is what you're all about. And I guess I was a little bit surprised to hear you talk about KidVid when you're talking about a content question, and really, that seems to be almost like a thing of the past. I mean, is that really such a big concern these days when people do have many options from a variety of sources, from the cloud, from wherever? So I just wonder if that's really we should be looking forward and clearing the decks for all the new technologies and things that are now available to people, and not really micromanaging what broadcasters and so many of them are legacy, but so many of them are new, and being concerned about what they do.
Your point is very well taken. I've made the same exact point recently in a blog on the topic, but there's two parts to the answer. One is that we have an existing statute that I can't ignore, the Children's Television Act, done in the early 1990s, and it has certain obligations, and so there are things that is that part. But what I can do is look at the rules that we have at the FCC and consider changing those to reflect the exact circumstances you just outlined. The market has changed underneath everyone's feet. Legacy broadcasters, where once were dominant in the position, are now facing a very competitive environment from multiple players, not just within the legacy space of cable or satellite, but the content providers from high-tech investors and companies that are really changing the marketplace. And so, like I use the example of YouTube. My daughter is figured. She's 2 1/4 and has figured out how to get programming from YouTube up and operational. But it takes just one click, and she's very impatient, as you can imagine. And one click, and you're all of a sudden watching Peppa Pig from Germany. You do one more click, and you're watching some Peppa Pig from some really dark viewpoints. That's a different problem, and one that we don't have authority to govern. But it gets to the issue of what does that mean for our rules over here, and should they still be sustainable? I envision a number of people who will comment and suggest that we don't need rules as they are formulated. I can certainly understand the argument. I tried to highlight that there's definitely a portion of the population that just gets over-the-top television for economic reasons, and we're trying to figure out how does that match up with the statute and what are our obligations to provide for them going forward. But it's not lost on me. Defining the marketplace is really important to me. It's something we're going to examine later this year as part of our quadrennial media ownership rules review, because I think you really have to look in a much broader perspective of who's competing in the space for the ears and eyes for the advertising dollars. It's really important to have a much broader viewpoint than just, I've critiqued Department of Justice and the FCC merger reviews in the past and talking about, AM radio only competes with AM radio, FM radio only competes with FM radio, and newspapers only compete with newspapers. That's a crazy perspective that no longer applies if it ever did.
One more here.
Dave Kaut, Communications Daily. You were very clear you want to set an overall USF budget, and you're very clear you don't want to raise it above what it currently would be in aggregate if you added those 4 numbers up, which comes out to around 11-point-something billion. Are you saying you would support an overall budget of 11-point-something billion, or are you going to be looking to push it down further?
I'm going to be, examining the issues as they come forward and seeing. I think what I outlined was that we want to have a very thoughtful discussion when people ask for more money. we expect them to find offsets in the process. We've authorized $11 billion. We've authorized E-rate to go to 3.94 and Lifeline to go to 2.25. Numbers I didn't agree with, actually, but we've authorized that, and people are starting to make decisions based on that. But I'm making the argument people are asking for even more. They want more money for Lifeline, more money for E-rate, more money for rural health care program. We're running upon our cap on that program, and people have said, well, double the program. And on high cost, I know it's something that you've raised before, what do we do on the high cost budget? And people ask for more money there. And what I'm saying, those trade-offs are going to have to be made by the commission. And there's been this informal détente where nobody would talk about someone else's program. I'll just get my money, you get your money, we'll never talk about how there's a problem. Well, there is a problem. And we're at 11 billion, and I'm not going to go above 11 billion. Maybe with inflation, I'll 11 point whatever, depending on the circumstance. But that's going to be where I'm at. And if you want to get above that number, they're not getting my vote.
One more, and this will be the last.
Hi, Preston Padden with OTA Broadcasting. I want to thank you for your call for reallocating at least 200 or 300 megahertz of C-band spectrum and mentioning the possibility of it happening through private sector forces, and give you the opportunity to expand on why that's important.
Well, this has been something that is important to me. We need more mid-band spectrum. I talked about CBRS. This is just above CBRS, 3.7 to 4.2. And if we can get 200, 300, maybe even 400 of the 500 total, at least in the short term, I think that's so valuable for making a mid-band play for 5G, for national carriers. I talked about in my speech why I think it's so important to lead on this issue. And those, tying that all together, that provides a big platform for the offering of new innovative opportunities that we don't know exactly what 5G is going to take us in what direction. The mechanism for relieving 3.7 to 4.2, the mechanism that has been put on the table by a number, there are two main proposals, but one that I really think has a lot of merit and needs to be explored fully is how do we do that through a private mechanism? How do we allow those that sit there today to potentially migrate to either a smaller share or potentially off the band? Because what the benefits can be is a much quicker clearing. We could certainly run an incentive auction, as we did in television, as many, 600 megahertz, as many of you have followed. It took us multiple years. It wasn't something, the auction itself takes only so amount of time, but leading up to that took multiple years, multiple Congresses. I was working on the Hill at the time when those statutes were going through. And so that's 2012 when the statute passed, but it had been a conversation that had been going on for a good 6 years before then. So to get to that point takes an awful long time. So we could do it that way. The government could be the market, basically make the market for that. But then you're talking a long time to clear. Well, we don't have a long time. We're really trying to make this something that we can do in the immediate, or at least in the very short term. There are some questions that go forward with that, and we hope to, we should certainly tee them up this year and this summer, I think, is the appropriate time to ask those questions so we can move forward. I really look forward to where we go in that mid-band spectrum, and then also in an unlicensed play at 6 gigahertz. I think the two are tied together, and I think they can move, I'd like to move them in one of the summer months with the J in it.
Well, Commissioner O'Rielly, thank you for being here today. You're making big change at the Federal Communications Commission. We're grateful and appreciate your service.
Thank you so very much. Thank you so very much, everyone. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Good to see you.
I think it's kind of like an award ceremony, right? Okay. This one might still be on. Not a presentation. I'm going to give an award, right? Who won the Emmy?